My name is Claire, and I took the job because I had no other option. I was 29, my savings a rumor, my last roommate moved out with half my dishes, and my student loans had a voice that would not stop. I had been nannying for odd families, houses with hardwood floors and better air, for 5 years. But this position paid in cash on arrival and promised room above the carriage house and an offer letter on thick stock. It sounded simple. It sounded like breathing space. I drove through fog until the GPS gave up, following a note Jonah had scribbled on the back of a receipt, a name and coordinates that were more a direction to an absence than a place. He waited in a parking lot with a thermos and clean boots, the sort of man who smiled like he owed nothing to anyone, and when he said, "Do you want the job?" his hand was steady and his pupils were too calm. He said the family needed a steady hand, someone to keep hours, someone who did not ask the kind of questions old friends ask when they worry. He said the house was isolated, the perfect place to get an extra savings cushion before the winter. I agreed, because what I had was not enough, and because I had learned to answer yes when opportunity wore a polite collar. On the passenger seat, my duffel smelled of dryer soap and regret. I remember thinking the loneliness would be easier to bear than the rent. The house was the kind of house that pretends to be a map of something ancient, all stone and slate and windows that did not reflect my face. It sat alone on a ribbon of land that met the sea on one side and a bristled stand of pines on the other. The road in was a cord of mud and glass from old lamps. On the approach, I listened to the car complaining, to the smell of salt and machine oil, to the distant call of gulls like pieces of conversation I could not join. When I arrived, Mrs. Hargreave opened the door like a portrait coming to life, pale hands folding around the frame of her waistcoat, her voice the hush of velvet. Her husband, Mr. Blackwell, was a man who kept a ledger of small cruelties, polite and precise. They showed me the room, a boxy space with thick curtains and a crib wrapped in a case like a reliquary. They offered me tea that tasted like the envelope of a prescription, reassuring and medicinal. The first nights were ritualistic and gentle, the house giving me work that fit into the thin bone of routine, and yet there was an odd cadence to everything, a notion that time bent inside those walls. The house had its own heart rate, and I had to learn it. At first, the noises were easy to name: pipes, wind, the old heater coughing. Later, I learned names that did not belong to ordinary mechanisms. I learned quickly that there are rules in every isolated place, unspoken pacts that keep the machinery of a small world turning. Rule 1, they told me in a kitchen lit by a single bulb, where Ada, the housekeeper, scrubbed plates until they gleamed like small moons, is do not open the nursery window at night. Ada said it softly and looked at the floor, as if the floor might be a willing witness. Her voice smelled like lemon and old starch. Rule 2 is always lock the carriage house door from the inside, even if you feel the urge to leave, because some departures are not meant to be a direction. Ada laughed when she said that and then washed her hands again. Rule 3 is never call a doctor unless someone else calls for you. That rule came as a sentence with an explanation that circled the room like a moth. The doctor had been once, when the infant was smaller, and Dr. Mercer had written notes in a hand too neat to be comforting, and his visit had been the origin of new ledgers and a silence that felt like a contract. I wrote these rules down on the envelope Jonah had given me, and folded them into my wallet like a talisman, because rules feel like safety when you are new in a place that moves around you like a stage. The rhythm of my days became simple and precise. I fed the baby at prescribed hours, I changed linens, I counted the breaths in the dark, because the house seemed to ask for an account. The first real wonder was the nursery itself. It was a room that pretended to be ordinary and failed with a kind of boldness. The crib was not wood, but a box of glass, a shallow aquarium of thick panes, and the mattress was a platform suspended above dark water. Light struck the glass in the afternoon and split into bands like a memory of the sea. There were toys that looked carved from bone and a mobile that turned without a breeze. On my first day I pressed my palm to the cool pane, and the baby looked back with eyes that were both too large and too quick, like something watching through a porthole. That first sight was wonder and a shiver braided together. The air in the nursery was always a little damp, a little cold. It smelled faintly of iodine and salt, and when the sunlight hit the water, the skin above the surface would gleam like an object pulled from a chest. I remember the sound of the baby breathing, as if through a shell, a soft sucking noise that filled the room like a secret someone tries not to tell. I told myself it was a marvel, a curiosity that would become ordinary, but the chest tightened every time. I left the door ajar. The veteran who taught me the mechanics was Lula, a woman who had been there longer than I had been alive in my town, and who moved with the economy of someone who knows every creak. She showed me how to ferry envelopes with food vouchers in the dead hours, how to leave and return without the house cataloging my absence, how to answer questions on nights when the storms made the supply runs impossible. Our conversations were pragmatic, but they were also the first time the house's softer edges showed. Lula would sit on the back step smoking and tell me stories in fragments, naming nurses and midwives, naming people who had passed through and never left. Her hands were the map of a life spent unlatching things. She taught me to watch the water for ripples that did not match wind, and to listen for a rhythm under the baby breathing that suggested hunger of a sort not met by milk. When I asked her why the owners left so many envelopes tucked in drawers, she said, "They pay with promises, not with wages." And that was the truth of it. In the pantry, I found stacks of sealed envelopes with scrawled notes, addresses that were postmarks of other lives, and a ledger Mr. Blackwell kept with numbers like small, indifferent prayers. The first real horror arrived like a small revelation and then built into proof. I found it at midnight when the house slept and the sea pressed against the windows with a patient hunger. The baby had been restless. When I stuck my head into the nursery, the water in the glass crib had a darker bloom at the bottom, and something pale and stringy floated like kittens caught on a sill. There were bones, small and white, caught in the folds of what looked like an old ceremonial shawl. And one of the toys, a carved whale, had a stain that was the exact color of rust and old iron. I should have screamed then. Instead, I stood and counted the breaths, and the baby turned and regarded me with an expression that was not infantile curiosity, but the slow study of something that recognizes the world as a menu. I ran to Lula in the carriage house and said, "There are bones in the crib," and she did not look surprised. Her face tightened, and she said softly, "This is eating, Claire. It is how it stays." I asked, "Who brings them? Who leaves them?" And she named Mrs. Hargrave, with a voice that was both complaint and acceptance. The evidence was physical and undeniable, and smelled faintly of sea and iron. I found a fragment of a poster in a drawer, an old church notice with a date and a name, and under the sealed envelopes I found a small card with the word contract printed and an address that matched the one Jonah had given me. The house was not faking tenderness, it was bartering for something. There were 3 moments of tension that stayed with me long after I left because they condensed the choice I had made into palpable, breathing things. The first moment was the night I saw the nursery door open on its own and felt the cold press of water vapor on my face. I stood with my hand on the knob, and the hallway smelled like boiled kelp in winter, and inside the glass the infant was perched on its forearms as if learning to crawl on the surface, eyes tracking me. I backed away, and the air in my lungs full of the metallic taste of fear. That passage of time, 5 heartbeats, is a presence I can still feel. The second moment was the conversation at the dining table with Mr. Blackwell, which began polite and then sharpened like a blade under a cloth. He asked me if I felt a calling in this work, and I said, "No, I took the job for rent," and he smiled as if pleasure could be made out of that which binds. Our exchange was a small duel. He said, "We provide continuity," and I said, "You provide something else."
He folded his hands and said, "The world is easier when people accept the terms." And I said, "Whose terms?" And he answered, "With all of ours," without specifying which ours. The third moment was my near discovery by a supply driver named Elsie, who knocked during a storm, and I hid under a wagon while she called for Lula by name. I listened to their conversation from the dark, and it was normal, the cadence of neighbors trading gossip, and I thought for the first time how fragile my exit might be. Each of those 10 slices lasted not long, but they extended into my sleep, each a small scar. Madame Astor arrived one wet afternoon on a supply run, when the motor car splashed and the sky was a sheet of brain gray. She claimed to be a midwife, and she brought a satchel of herbs that smelled like thyme and something bitter. She had a voice that fit the creases in her face and hands that seemed to know the interiors of strangers. There was something about her that made the house relax in a way I had not seen. She called me Claire and said, "You look like someone who remembers a normal life," and offered me no sympathy I did not need. In her caravan, which stood like a painted caution, she kept a deck of cards that were not quite tarot, but leaned into the same language, images faded at the edges. She taught me how to read a face for fatigue, and how to find the small notations in ledgers that mean more than sums. We sat at the kitchen table, and she looked at my folded envelope of rules and said, "You were given rules.
To hold you, not to save you," which was both tender and cruel. She gave me a small stone that warmed against my palm and said, "Use it when the water smells of iron, and you cannot tell how much of the infant is hungry and how much is something else." Madame Astor became the person I could put the truth in front of, and she smiled in ways that suggested she carried her own weight of secrets. The contract, I discovered, was not a single document, but a pattern. There were notes in Mr. Blackwell's ledger that referred to names and dates and items exchanged, as if the family traded favors and things that could not be labeled currency. I confronted him once in the library, a room with books that smelled of glue and old paper, and our conversation became the unspooling of a polite cruelty. He asked, "What were you hoping for?" And I said, "A place to save and catch my breath," and he said, "There are always costs to shelter." He slid a card across the table with an address and a clause in a small cramped print that read, "All services rendered are subject to non-withdrawal clauses." He said, "You are safe here if you honor the account," and I said, "And if I do not?" He smiled and said, "Then you will leave," and the smile did not extend far enough. The language of the contract was mercantile and precise, a ledger of appetite written under the assumption of consent. I thought of Jonah in the parking lot with his steady hand and realized the recruiting was a system, not a favor. The house was a machine that made its own workers, and the more time you put into its gears, the more it confirmed you belonged to it. The confrontation that changed everything happened the night I decided I could not be an accessory to what the house required. I approached Mrs. Hargreave in the nursery while the baby slept, the glass reflecting our faces like 2 pebbles thrown into a pool. We spoke in clipped sentences that were both polite and final. I said, "I cannot leave the bones in the crib," and she said, "You do not understand the nature of provision." I pressed, and she dropped her gaze and told me of a debt that was not hers but had been inherited, a thing older than ledger, and the baby, she explained with a softness that betrayed no remorse, was the mechanism by which they repaid. The conversation became urgent, 8 exchanges of accusations and assurances, her voice gliding and mine cracking. I asked, "Where do they come from?" And she answered, "They come from need." And she said, "We do not take what is not offered." And I said, "People are not offerings." And she said, "The world has many hunger shapes." And I said, "Are you telling me the house eats to survive?" And she said, "We survive how we must." In the room, the water trembled, and the baby turned and looked at us both. And in its eyes I saw no malice, but the simple arithmetic of appetite, the kind of accounting that always includes someone losing. When I raised my voice, the house seemed to listen, and the chandelier rattled as if clapping. That night I decided to leave with as much evidence as I could collect. The escape was less cinematic than I imagined, and closer to a sequence of small, resolute steps. I wrote a letter that became my ticket, addressed it to Madame Astor, and folded it into an envelope with instructions. I stole a page from the ledger and tucked it under my mattress for proof, and I packed only what I could carry without notice. My route was the one Luke and Ada had used to move between the kitchen and the carriage house, through a window that opened to a stretch of moor where the ground softened to peat. 1 month after I left, I had traded the salt air for a room in a 2-flat with a neighbor who played the clarinet and a job at a cafe where the orders were human and error forgivable. 3 months after I had been in a new town, I enrolled in a night class in bookkeeping, and I taught myself to balance numbers like I balanced my breathing. 6 months after the house, I received a postcard from Madame Astor with a sentence and a stamp that smudged under rain. "You chose a small life and a brave one." I kept that card pinned to my wall, and, on nights when the memory of that glass crib rose like a tide, I read it until the edges of the words blurred into comfort. There are things I want to tell you if you are listening, because I was the kind of person who said yes out of necessity, and I want to offer some rules that are not the house rules, but survival rules. Rule 1. Trust your senses, even if everyone around you chooses not to. Rule 2. Keep evidence, photographs, envelopes, ledgers, whatever proves a practice beyond explanation. Rule 3. Find an ally like Madame Astor, someone who will not mock your fear and who knows the language of small trades. If you are ever offered a position that comes with vague addresses and tidy cash in hand, ask for the contract up front and read the small print. If someone says they will provide continuity, ask instead, who do you claim continuity from? I am telling you these things because I left with more than a suitcase. I left with names. Jonah, Lula, Ada, Elsie, Dr. Mercer, Madame Astor, Mr. Blackwell, and Mrs. Hargreave are names I call aloud like an inventory, a way to keep the story circumscribed. I do not want to end with a heroic flourish, because I did not die. A blaze of cinematic proof. I almost did not leave at all. I could have stayed and learned to not notice, and I could have slept through the bones until they were only pattern. Instead, I wrote a letter, made a plan, and walked in the dark until dawn layered the world in ordinary color again. If you are here because this scratches at something you believe impossible, comment below with what you would do if you were me. Start your reply with "I would stay" or "I would leave" so that we can hold simple choices in plain sight. If this story touched you and you want more investigations of places that promise shelter at a cost, consider subscribing. I tell these stories because someone once told me to keep my head down, and I learned the hard way that looking up is how you find the exits. They offered me a job and a house, and it took me time to see the price. Read the small print, keep your envelopes, and do not let the glass convince you that what floats inside is only a baby.